Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I removed and installed the starter on my Jeep Patriot 2009 2.4 liter. I live up north and my Jeep is 11 years old, so I wanted to perform a visual inspection of the starter and clean the electrical contacts. On this vehicle, the starter is located in a space between the intake manifold and the engine block. It is normally reached by removing some components. To begin, I installed basic lighting under the hood and I removed the air inlet to gain access to the battery. As normal procedure, I disconnected the negative cable first. I also added a protective cap on the pole to prevent any bad contacts. When it was done, I disconnected the positive cable and I added the second cap. To ease the overall removal and make more room to work, I decided to remove the battery. To unfasten the bolt at the base of the battery, I used a 13mm socket with an extension bar. Note, because there was no more 12-volt power, I had to reset the radio and the clock later after the job. Again, to make a little more room, I took away the engine plastic cover. Before removing the flexible air intake hose, I disconnected the air temperature sensor connector as shown. To remove the hose, I began by loosening the upper clamp and I pulled it out. It was more difficult to gain access to the lower clamp. To be able to have more freedom to slacken the lower clamp, I unfastened the bracket holding the radiator hose. Even if I was using a very small ratchet, it was quite difficult to insert my arm and loosen the lower clamp. Still, there was an attachment under the air tube that was holding a bundle of wires with a plastic fastener. The fastener was strongly attached, so I had to cut it out. After that, I had no problem to remove the air tube. I needed only a bit of wiggling and pulling. There was some dirt and dust inside the throttle body, but I removed it easily with a vacuum cleaner. After, I used a clean rag to plug the throttle body opening. Like I usually do, I sprayed some penetrating fluid on the bolts to ease the job. While the fluid was acting, I disconnected 2 more electrical cables in order to increase the space to be able to use my tools. With more room, it was easy to unfasten the 3 bolts holding the throttle body bracket. I used a 10mm socket to remove the 2 small bolts and a 13mm socket for the bigger one. The small bolts were corroded, but I cleaned them later on. Note, it is also possible to remove the throttle body to take out the starter more easily. The intake vacuum line was also disconnected to allow more movement with my tools. To undo the 2 remaining bolts holding the starter on the flywheel housing, I used a short ratchet with a 15mm socket. To add more leverage, I used a small ratchet extension bar with a long socket. Once the bolts were loosened, I used a small wrench to complete the work. First, without the starter harness restriction, I slowly positioned the starter in a lower position in the space behind the intake manifold. After, I carefully pulled it out at a specific angle to make it fit between the parts, as shown. This procedure was good enough to avoid hitting the knock sensor. Before disconnecting any wire, the starter was put on the side. I paid attention on how the starter and the harness were positioned to reinstall them properly later on. After, it was okay to move the starter and disconnect the wires. To undo the nut holding the eyelet connector assembly, I used a 13mm socket. I was happy to see that the connectors were not corroded and were in good condition. I inspected the braided copper wire and it was still good enough to last 2 or 3 years. After, I cleaned the electrical contacts and the starter was ready to be reinstalled. The eyelet connector assembly was reconnected and the 13mm nut was tightened. The torque specification for this nut is 90 inch-pounds. The small connector with a yellow wire was fine and was connected as shown. Before inserting the starter, I positioned the loose cables to avoid any interference. When I inserted the starter in the lower space, I made sure it was safely located under the knock sensor. Then I pulled it back into its original location and it was positioned to be fastened with the 2 retaining bolts. I began by installing the bolt holding the chassis ground connector and I continued with the lower bolt. I tightened them with my short ratchet wrench. Later the final torque was set to 40 foot-pounds. the throttle body bracket was held with 3 bolts. The torque for the 2 small bolts was set to 65 inch-pounds. Just in case that the throttle body had been reinstalled, the 4 bolts would have been tightened in a cross pattern. The torque for the bolt installed on the rubber bushing was set to 18 foot-pounds. After this procedure, I double-checked if the starter harness was still properly routed. I was satisfied with it, and I began by installing the intake manifold vacuum line. Once done, I removed the clean rag from the throttle body. The radiator hose was let loose to reinstall the intake air tube. I positioned the tube and I checked if it was well installed on the throttle body. After, I connected and locked the electrical connectors on the manifold flow valve and on the intake air temperature sensor. I also completed the tightening of the 2 clamps to secure the intake manifold air tube. The other components like the radiator tube bracket and the battery tray were also reinstalled. Finally, I installed a better battery to replace the old one. The battery cables were reconnected and it was time to test the starter. The engine started easily and the rest of the components were reinstalled.
Normally, people don't inspect the starter like I did, but at least with this presentation, you have the basic information on how to do the work.